If there's anyone out there that doubts the existence of God or at least a powerful cosmic entity, let 2023 be the year that finally squashes those doubts once and for all. I've always said that the original Dead Space is the better version of Resident Evil 4, since it excelled at balancing horror with action and still managed to keep a tense atmosphere, a belief that I still hold to this day. And yet, the remakes of both of those games are getting released in the same year, mere months apart, with the Dead Space remake being released a month after the Callisto Protocol, the game that was led by one of the creators of the original Dead Space, and simply turned out to be a worse version of Dead Space. That's something you couldn't have planned better if you tried. And I'm happy to report that Dead Space 2023 is easily among the better remakes in video game history, mainly because it went the route of RE1 Remake, where it takes the basic foundation of an already great game and improves upon it without eliminating too many of the good things that made it great in the first place. And it fixes the few segments that were flawed in the original. To be fair, you'd have to be pretty stupid to screw up a remake to a game that was already great to begin with. Looking at you, Twin Snakes. But one of the biggest reasons why the Dead Space remake succeeds so well is that it actually remains faithful to the original. Okay? Yeah, unlike some other remakes I can mention that decided to take the same basic story of its original game and wildly reimagine it while negatively changing certain character personalities and removing a lot of the good stuff that made those games so beloved. The original Dead Space is such an exceptional game for the horror genre that it still holds up to this day. I know, because I literally replayed it on my Twitch stream right before the remake released. So I guess the only question that ultimately matters is, did Dead Space really need to be remade? No, it didn't, but I am damn glad it was. And with it being the first horror remake of 2023, the horror genre is going to be experiencing quite the renaissance. You would think with this game taking place far into the future that they would have perfected anti-aging technology so that Nicole doesn't look like a MILF auditioning for her next Brazzers scene. And to be honest, I don't like the character redesigns on anybody. Isaac himself just looks like a Lance Armstrong Philip DeFranco goober, Hammond looks like a default black creative character in Def Jam Vendetta, and Kendra just looks like your best friend's mom being average at best. This would have been a lot more acceptable if Isaac himself remained as seasoned looking as he did in the original. To be fair, they at least got Gunnar Wright to return to the role of Isaac, who voiced him in Dead Space 2 and 3. So that way the series maintains some semblance of consistency. It's just weird that they only seem to want consistency in certain aspects.
Isaac, it's me. I wish I could talk to you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about everything. I just wish I could talk to someone. It's all falling apart here. I can't believe what's happening.
This is one-to-one what Nicole said in the opening of the original Dead Space. And even though it's appreciated, just like the original, she's not exactly sounding like someone who's minutes away from deleting herself due to the dreadful situation aboard the Ishimura. I had the fortune of watching Dead Space Downfall before making this video to refresh my memory on the events leading up to Dead Space 1, and Alyssa Vincent, the main character of that film, did a much better job at not only letting us know how dire the situation was aboard the Ishimura, but also sets the tone as to what awaits us when we do board it. I'm not sure whether Dead Space Downfall is considered canon, but if it is, that's a major missed opportunity to include her as an important character in the remake, to give context as to what happened before the events of Dead Space 1. Maybe even have her as a survivor you come across.
You ever hear of a full communications blackout on one of these things?
No.
I mean, you should. One of your mission objectives literally states that you need to diagnose and repair a communications blackout. Kind of an odd thing to forget about for a computer specialist, even if you're trying to be more discreet about your true intentions. Everybody on the Kellion remains in their seat when it crashes despite not wearing any seatbelts or having any armrests. Isaac is an engineer who is supposed to repair the communications blackout, yet he doesn't bring any tools with him to help him accomplish that task. Also, you would think with a ship this big that they would send more than 5 people to investigate and repair it, especially given the statement Isaac said about him and Kendra being able to repair the Ishimura in under 48 hours. If it takes 2 people that long to fix communications, you clearly came underprepared. You would need more people than just Isaac and Kendra, the former of which is the only engineer on the team. This is a badass moment and all, but hazardous anomaly is such a vague term to be using, especially when we're in space aboard a planet cracker that's meant to extract valuable resources. Dangerous life form would be a lot more accurate to describe the necromorphs, given that the Church of Unitology isn't exactly a secret organization in the game's universe at this time. So the Ishimura must have been going through frequent complete lockdowns if they come across any old hazardous anomalies. Awesome iconic moment and all, but this just proves that elevators are more devastating than any of the weapons I use in this game. Endgame. Surprised Isaac doesn't use any of this ingenuity to take apart some of the elevators and construct a close-range mega clamp that uses its devastating force to squash necromorphs in one shot. Minor nitpick, but still a sin, Isaac's stomp doesn't feel as visceral as it did in the original. The stomp, along with the dismemberment tech, is part of Dead Space's most recognizable aspects, and arguably what makes it so famous. So it's something the remake had to get right, but it lacks the oomph and feels janky here. My dude is out here thumping like he's doing the weakest lunges possible instead of releasing years of pent-up frustration on the guy that's been harassing his wife. That's why they had to make Isaac use curse words after stomping for a while to make it seem like it's more devastating than it actually is. Speaking of things that lack oomph, the iconic plasma cutter no longer feels like a devastating force to be reckoned with. Instead, unironically feeling less threatening than the super soaker water guns I used to have as a kid. To demonstrate what I mean, this is how the plasma cutter sounds like now in the remake. And this is how it used to sound. See the difference that makes? My long-running phrase of details are important continues to prove why it's long-running. The plasma cutter may be one of the few weapons in gaming history where it's the starting weapon you will continue to use more often than the others you obtain later on. But it doesn't contain the pure power that would make it the legendary satisfying device it deserves to be.
The ones I saw, some of them were wearing Ishimura uniforms.
They're the crew? How the hell can they be the crew? Look at them.
We need to get to the bridge. There's 1,000 people on board. Someone will be there.
1,000 people on board should have meant we come across a lot more enemies than we did. I'm telling you, should have added a couple new innovative weapons to vary up the gameplay while facing off against more enemies, and you would have had an even better remake than what we got.
Isaac, don't bother shooting those fuckers in the head. Doesn't even slow them down.
Okay. The only way is hacking them apart. Those arms, their legs.
Does that even kill them? Or do they just stop moving?
Hacking them apart just makes me disappointed that we couldn't turn the plasma cutter into a plasma sword and use it as a melee weapon to vary up what is arguably the most useful weapon in the game. Everyone knows how useful and kick-ass Stasis is. However, there's a bit of inconsistency in its design. In gameplay, it merely slows down enemies for a short amount of time so that you can use your weapons to kill them. Yet later on in the game's narrative, Mercer is able to completely immobilize Isaac the way Stasis should work, and does so for an inordinate amount of time. You might say this was obviously done for gameplay purposes or it being explained later on, which is true, but Mass Effect never had any discrepancies with its biotics during gameplay or its narrative, as their duration lasted as long in-game as it does its story. So that's one defense that doesn't really work here, seeing as how it can be done. Speaking of Mass Effect, Dead Space is a series that features a cult that worships ancient alien technology that alters thought patterns to the point where it causes hallucinations, and eventually leads to corpses being mutated through an extraterrestrial signal, which is ultimately controlled by gigantic aliens who are the result of a final ascension process that they call a convergence event. Sound familiar? How truly fascinating that the first entry in both of these series were released barely a year apart. Though Mass Effect's version makes a bit more sense given the fact that the Reapers use their own technological means to convert different species to serve them, while converting an organism into a necromorph is done through more sci-fi mumbo-jumbo, especially when you consider necromorphs try to spread their infection to create more necromorphs, yet have shown on multiple occasions hacking people to pieces while they're still alive, thus deterring the possibility of creating more necromorphs.
What's the plan?
You and Johnston fix up the Kellyan. We report to the bridge. Standard emergency protocol.
What? Protocol? Hammond, people are dying here.
And I'm not losing anyone else. We stick to procedure. We'll get through this.
Even though Kendra has nefarious plans, this is one of the only times where she's actually making sense. Hammond knows that the Ishimura is overrun with necromorphs and just saw one attack and kill Chen earlier. I don't think standard procedure is a viable course of action at this point anymore.
The Ishimura's overrun with... They're fucking monsters. You didn't hear anything?
What? No, the comms are still out.
Yeah, the comms are down. For the Ishimura. You can still communicate with Isaac through the live video calls just like he's been able to do with Hammond and Daniels so far. See, I was willing to chalk up these video calls as nothing more than some advanced holographic projection. But when the mutated Chen attacks Hammond and Daniels, the camera falls down as if it was set up on a tripod, since it remains on the floor when they flee instead of staying on them as if it was built into their suit. Hell has truly frozen over when we live in a time where I'm not sending EA for being, well, EA. We actually have a complete product with very little bugs and isn't filled with egregious microtransactions meant to ruin our fun. That is until you realize that items in the store are more expensive than what they were in the original Dead Space, mainly with large med packs costing twice as much as they were before. Don't get it twisted, ladies and gentlemen. EA is basically doing what Konami's pulling right now, trying to get back into the good graces of gamers. Not because they actually want to improve and be better, but because they're desperate and have no other choice, because their scummy business practices and other ventures aren't working as well anymore. One thing that's definitely worth removing a sin for is the fact that the Ishimura is now fully explorable, instead of being locked out of certain areas once you complete a chapter like in the original. It gets even better with the addition of the security clearance system that will encourage more backtracking to gain more upgrades. A welcome inclusion for classic Resident Evil fans such as myself. It's just one of the many improvements that allow this remake to be worth playing.
Medical's a slaughterhouse. They barricaded access to the morgue.
The morgue?
Yeah, but the barricade was put together in a hurry. A hydrazine tank might blow it open. Just need a detonator, like maybe a shock pad.
Well, if the barricade was put together in a hurry, meaning it's not as sturdy as it can be, shouldn't you be able to use your kinesis and just remove it that way, so that you don't need a hydrazine tank and shock pad to begin with? Or your pulse rifle that now has grenades as its alt fire? Or the plasma cutter that dismembers necromorph limbs that's also meant to cut through metal? Speaking of the pulse rifle, one of the most unnecessary changes is that it no longer has the "fuck you, I'm clearing the area" alt fire. That was one of the most unique and badass ways to dispose of necromorphs. Why remove it, you may ask? The excuse will probably hear is that it was busted and easily abused. You want to know how you fix that in the remake? You design it to where the pulse rifle has separate ammo for its alt fire, and lock them behind the new security clearance area so that it's an exclusive reward for people who backtracked. That way, when you do get it, you appreciate it more, and use it more sparingly. You'll still have it, but you'll basically use it for emergency purposes only. And it's decisions like this that keep the Dead Space remake from reaching the legendary status that RE1 Remake achieved over 20 years ago.
Dr. Mercer continues to interfere. He claims Harris's delusions are religiously significant. If I have to make a complaint, I will. I'm not losing my patient over unitology bullshit. Not again.
Not again, you say? Meaning this has happened more than once and Nicole never thought about sending a warning to Isaac sooner to come save her from insane cult shenanigans, despite all their differences that we'll discover later on? Game pulls the cliche of telling their story almost entirely through text and audio logs, despite the addition of new cinematics and holographic projections. Zero gravity is just as disorienting as you'd expect. However, I still wanted to at least be able to melee while floating around. Leapers are able to attack you mid-air, so I would have liked a way to defend myself without having to expend ammo, especially since Isaac already has a melee in regular combat. If you want to balance it out a bit, each time you were to hit an enemy, Isaac would get even more disoriented and you'd have to use your commands to stabilize him. Just when I thought AAA gaming was finally correcting itself, I come across an embarrassing glitch that robs me of one of the coolest scenes in the game where the lurker reveals itself. Man must have been using some impressive time traveling tech to see how the first Dead Space played out, wanted no part of his own demise, and decided to use this highly advanced T-pose trick to prevent himself from taking damage at all costs. And it worked. Isaac unfortunately relinquishes some of his masculine energy by hiding behind cover while the hydrazine tank and shock pad explode the barricade, whereas he stood in front of it like a G in the original. On a few occasions, Isaac will interact with Hammond or Daniels and have a change in plans wherein your mission objectives will display "Objective Cancelled," as if you had any choice in the matter. It would have made more sense if Dead Space allowed you to tackle objectives in a matter that was in a different order than how it was designed. But despite the extra backtracking and open-ended level design, it's still very much linear in its narrative. Thus, there's no reason to display Objective Cancelled if that's how it was always going to play out. Dead Space is probably the only game I've played where the flamethrower is the most worthless weapon, which is shameful. It's really only useful against swarmers, and even though they introduce the firewall that obstructs enemies from approaching you, this is a game where the primary gameplay mechanic is to dismember limbs from necromorphs to kill them. It gets even worse when you realize you have a much more effective way of eliminating necromorphs by using kinesis on explosive canisters and tossing it towards them, thus making the flamethrower feel even more useless, even if those explosive canisters aren't as common throughout the levels.
I'm not seeing things, right? That's Chen.
You can't help him, Hammond. He's...
You're right. I should... The hell with it.
Genius idea, Hammond. The Kellion is destroyed, all the other escape pods have been released, and the Ishimura is barely stable and still overrun with necromorphs. And his brilliant plan is to release the one last escape pod of a necromorph he should have at least immobilized, wherein Isaac should have at least informed Hammond about cutting off their limbs over the video call. A big change to the Brute is how it no longer has vulnerable arm parts for you to hit to disable its movement like you could in the original. Rather, the remake encourages you to use Stasis, then move behind it to target its weak spots, which is what us OG players already did in the original game as a cheap tactic just to cheese it. And now, it's actively encouraged. I understand wanting to ease the player into learning and adapting Stasis into their gameplay, but there's literally a section later on featuring a battle against a Brute where Stasis stations are available and in a far more enclosed area. You could have taught the player the Stasis tactic in that particular section. So I understand what the game was going for, but it didn't need to sacrifice a core component of an enemy for tactics that the player was already going to learn eventually in the first place. Even in a quality remake, there is no escape from the rule of 3 cliche. To the game's credit, it did fix the infamous ADS cannon section, where you had to hide behind cover to avoid taking incoming asteroid damage while making your way towards the cannons, and then attempt to destroy the asteroids using one of the worst controls I've ever had the displeasure of using. I played that section on mouse and keyboard and still had a rough time, so I can only imagine how awful it must have been using a controller. Now, it's a section where you still have to prevent asteroids from damaging you and the ship, but it's entirely in zero gravity, and the aiming controls for the cannons are much smoother.
This is Senior Medical Officer Nicole Brennan. Medical is a sanctuary. All survivors, please join us.
Nicole, I'm going back to medical.
So you all just heard that Isaac is going back to medical, meaning he's been there before already. So why would he believe that Nicole is there and that medical is a sanctuary when he never saw any evidence of survivors or Nicole's presence? The marker hasn't started affecting him yet, and Daniels was the one who intercepted that message. And she's been displaying some rather questionable behavior between going silent for long periods of time and accusing Hammond of covertly operating under the CEC.
But even if I was to ask, I suspect you're not the talkative type.
That would be true if you were talking about OG Dead Space Isaac. This Isaac has been upgraded with a full set of vocal cords, and I don't know why Mercer would think Isaac's not the talkative type. He was just speaking to him over the intercom not that long ago when Isaac returned to medical.
Try and relax, Mr. Clark. Convergence is so close. Maybe your death will tip the balance.
Ah, what do we got here? A villain who likes to monologue about mumbo jumbo while mocking the protagonist with a significantly more powerful Stasis. And he deliberately misses out on a perfect opportunity to kill the protagonist and instead wants to sick the hunter on him to experiment with dismemberment. I mean, at least Mercer could have blasted Isaac with Stasis one more time so that he'd have no way of escaping, and making it easier for the hunter to kill him. Foolishness, Mercer. Complete and utter foolishness. What kind of buffoonery is this, putting side missions in a horror game? Especially when it doesn't help that they barely provide anything useful besides a few story bits and lore dumps. I was expecting at least a side mission exclusive upgrade or enemy encounter. Something that would actually encourage you to complete the side mission and make their inclusion more meaningful. But it never happened.
It's all gone. Everything we grew.
Girl, you clearly still have food and flora growing inside some parts of hydroponics.
You're Elizabeth Cross, right? This Leviathan, is that what's poisoning the air?
The air. Team has destroyed everything. I designed a special enzyme to kill it. I just needed liquid nitrogen to complete the synthesis.
So I guess you're not going to explain how you created a special enzyme for an organism you've never encountered before, or at the very least, have little to no knowledge of its genetic makeup.
My team has been altered. They're all connected to the Leviathan, breathing out its toxins. That connection goes both ways.
Okay, so if I get to your team and inject them,
The enzyme will be carried right into the Leviathan's heart.
This is now the reason as to why you're able to gain access to food storage after killing the Weezers. A fair enough one at that. However, it presents the illogical situation as to why the Weezers are just completely invulnerable when you stomp them. They're necromorphs who are bound to the floor and are incapable of moving. The stomp is an essential combat mechanic in Dead Space. You can see how this presents quite the contradiction in the gameplay experience. The Leviathan boss fight is unfortunately one aspect that I think did not improve in the remake. As much as people rightfully complained about zero gravity in the OG Dead Space, it at least allowed you to anticipate when the Leviathan was going to attack. Space jump to a different position to get a good shot at its weak point, then go to town on it. Sure, it was a bit of a cheeseball tactic, but it was effective. Now, with Zero G redone, you don't have that level of mobility anymore. Instead, you're relegated to using what you can to strafe since it's only reorienting your position.
Anyone there?
Hammond? Where are you?
In the vents, hoping they don't hear me.
Just a reminder, there are a number of occasions where necromorphs will spawn out of vents, as it's their primary use of travel throughout the Ishimura, and a great method of surprise attacks. So the idea of Hammond being able to travel through said vents and not being killed by now is kinda bullshit. Oh, Mass Effect Elevator. I thought we had gotten rid of you a long time ago, yet you still decide to haunt me.
Oh my god. I can't believe you're here.
Boy, quite the betrayal of Nicole's character we have here, right? That's because this isn't really Nicole. The original game had the twist that Isaac was merely seeing an illusion of Nicole for the entire game and that she had been dead the whole time. And her acting is what sold that twist so well. Like she was actually your loved one you hadn't seen in forever and was happy to see you once more. Just listen to the difference in tone. This is how Nicole sounds like in the remake.
The beacon, right. They locked it in the workshop, but my clearance can get us in this way.
And this is how she sounded in the original.
Isaac? Is that really you? It feels like it's been so long. But I can help you now. Come with me.
You see how she comes off as cold, callous, and distant in the remake? Like she's not that eager to see you, and thus you don't feel motivated enough to try and save her. Yeah, this isn't Nicole, so it makes sense for the change in character. But the game still tries to use the same storytelling method from the original as if it is. And that's why the twist doesn't make sense or feel as satisfying as it should. And there's this new twist that this Nicole is actually Elizabeth Cross, the survivor who contacted Isaac when he entered hydroponics, and the woman who asked him to find her lover Jacob. So this Nicole, who is actually Cross, is actually in this part of the ship and apparently could have looked for Jacob on her own. Especially since the Leviathan is removed from food storage, which was the entire reason she stayed behind.
At least the beacon's away. I'm aligning the... Wait. Array receiver not responding. Oh shit.
The comms array. We never fixed it. Guess there wasn't a broken encoder.
Why would you even need the comms array to get the signal beacon working in the first place? The whole point of a beacon is to use an alternative means of communication to radio for help whenever regular comms are malfunctioned. That's how the Ishimura was able to send an SOS to the Kellyon in the first place. If you need an encoder for a beacon to work properly, you're kind of canceling out an effective rescue method. I do have to give props to how this remake completely redid this comm array section to where it's a legit puzzle in Dead Space, which is something we rarely get. You actually have to look at what direction the working dishes are pointing at and align them on the path that reaches the ceiling. So, congratulations on including something that actually requires me to use my brain a bit, and is almost reminiscent of a classic Resident Evil puzzle. Mofo out here looking like he's rocking one of those awful tryhard skins that he bought with his premium battle pass.
We picked up your escape pod number 47 and are en route to your position.
Let it be known that the Valor is a military ship filled with highly trained soldiers, so you would think that being this far into the future, they would have the technology to detect unknown or dangerous life forms in an escape pod. Hell, the Ishimura initiated an automatic lockdown because it detected hazardous anomalies. But not only are they unable to detect a necromorph inside the escape pod and prepare for it, that same necromorph was able to decimate all those trained soldiers aboard the Valor, while Isaac, who is an engineer, is able to survive an onslaught of necromorphs aboard the much larger Ishimura. The organism blocking the main comm array turns out to be the Leviathan, which somehow reattached itself to the Ishimura after it got spaced earlier. So the way we're supposed to eliminate it now is basically the same method that we thought disposed of it earlier by firing on it. Does it make for a better boss fight than the slug from the original? I guess, depending on your point of view. Does it make much sense? No.
This is Commander Cadigan to all hands. We have been boarded by hostile forces. Hostiles are aliens. Repeat, alien, and extremely dangerous.
So you all just heard the commander say that the Valor was boarded by aliens. Aliens, as in plural, meaning more than one. Yet the escape pod they intercepted only had one necromorph, the one that used to be Chen.
Hammond, this doesn't add up. If the Valor was just on patrol, why bring a nuke? And if they had a target, what's out here except us?
Isaac, the Valor is a military ship. It's supposed to be armed with heavy weaponry. As for what's out here besides you, the necromorphs, which you have been fighting against this entire time that obviously spawned from something much more dangerous? I do have to remove a sin for how much better they handled Hammond's death in the remake, simply because it was more personal. He had mentioned multiple times how much Chen meant to him, and by this point, the game has already dropped hints that the marker is now starting to take its toll on the mental state of everyone. That's why Hammond thought it was Chen in his normal state by the time he got impaled. So that's why it was much more satisfying seeing him suffer his fate at the hands of someone close to him rather than a random brute.
Chen, Johnston, now Hammond, and I'm tracking movement from the Valor. I think some of those mutated soldiers made it on board.
The Valor just got blown to pieces. How did anything on board manage to survive, much less make it on to the Ishimura? Come to think of it, how does the Ishimura not suffer more structural damage given that the Valor crashed into it and it just got obliterated? Not a good idea to prevent the player from progressing to a different room just because you want the dialogue to finish. 2023 video game, ladies and gentlemen, and it still couldn't correct a simple task like keeping the pacing fluid or at least add a fade to black skip function for those who just want to get on with it. Really, game? Level 3 clearance for a mere 100 credits? Earlier, Mercer basically thanked Isaac for fixing the Ishimura engines and hinted at taking it to Earth to kickstart a convergence event. So one has to wonder what the hell Mercer's been doing this whole time, since he hasn't been aware of the singularity core Isaac and Kendra have planned to use on the executive shuttle. Isaac finally meets up with Dr. Kyne in person, and Kyne reveals the fact that when the marker was taken from Aegis 7, it awakened the hive mind that was dormant on that planet, which is responsible for controlling the necromorphs telepathically. And he suggests taking the marker back to calm the creature and return it to its slumber, which doesn't make any sense. That still leaves the hive mind alive, and whomever else comes across Aegis 7 would suffer the same fate as the colonists who extracted the marker. The whole purpose of necromorphs is to convert more bodies into more necromorphs to spread their infection. They're not going to be able to accomplish that with the marker back on Aegis 7. I would have forgiven this if the game made it very clear that the marker has successfully infiltrated Kyne's mind and using Kyne to lure Isaac to Aegis 7 to eliminate him, since the marker sees Isaac as a threat that is preventing the necromorphs from spreading. But Kyne still comes off as if he's genuinely trying to help Isaac and hasn't succumbed to the marker's influence yet. Kind of weird how rocket heat is what destroys the hunter when it doesn't completely incinerate its body. Some of it still remains. Since it basically acts like Nemesis from Resident Evil, I was expecting a Nemesis type ending where it gets completely obliterated, like somehow finding a method that spaces it, divert it into the path of the Ishimura's main gun it uses to planet crack, and use whatever power it has left to annihilate it that way. Would have been an interesting change to the remake, I'd say. It's kind of cool how the remake portrays Mercer as more sinister with wicked intentions and cracks once Isaac has foiled his plans, and becomes desperate to want convergence to occur, only for the marker to outright reject him. Though I gotta say, it's not quite as satisfying as watching an infector grant his wish only for us to kill him ourselves in gameplay like the original did. This is a video game after all. Can't completely take away control from us and still expect us to feel fulfilled. Just like the original, Daniels reveals her treachery by killing Kyne after the marker got loaded onto the shuttle. And just like the original, it doesn't make any sense. If the whole purpose is to tie up loose ends or clean up a very old mess, as she'll even say, then she should have killed Kyne and Isaac to make absolutely sure all traces of her betrayal are never found. Even makes the mistake of revealing the details of her master plan to Isaac while he's still alive like a true cornball villain.
Recalling shuttle USG-09. Prepping remote docking procedures.
Damn it, Isaac! You don't know what you're doing!
I know. I'm finally doing the smart thing.
You fucking kidding me? Shit!
Warning. Escape pod launch detected from shuttle USG-09.
Let us remind you all that Daniels is a computer specialist who has been helping Isaac navigate through the Ishimura by hacking through its systems. You mean to tell me she couldn't find a way to disable the remote docking procedures, especially given the condition the Ishimura is in? By this point, the marker's imprint on Isaac's psyche has intensified to where it's even obvious to us. Yet it still hasn't influenced him enough to avoid returning the marker to Aegis 7. The hive mind is still on Aegis 7, and there's still a huge chunk of the planet that's above it that's only being held by gravity tethers. And what's even more bizarre is that once the marker is returned to its pedestal, it will emit a signal that will release the gravity tethers and drop that huge chunk of the planet back down on it, thus defeating the purpose of using the marker to spread its contagion. The final chapter of the game remains a slog, using the loading track to bring the marker back to the excavation site. It moves slow, so you'll have to make do with horde rushes to keep the game interesting. Even has a final zero gravity segment that, although a bit more intriguing than the original, is still puzzling when you consider we're now planetside. It turns out that the Nicole Isaac has been communicating with was Elizabeth Cross this whole time. This is a drastic change from the twist of before, and it's a terrible change for the sole reason that it doesn't add up. In the original game, the Nicole that was communicating with Isaac was nothing more than a hallucination caused by the marker, and that Nicole had been dead the whole time. It even had that clever detail where if you took the first letters of each chapter, it would spell out Nicole is dead, something that they kept in this remake. Isaac was simply obeying what the marker wanted him to do. The remake changes this to where the marker influences Isaac and Cross to make Isaac see Cross as Nicole and Cross see Isaac as her boyfriend Jacob. That means the Nicole you saw at the maintenance subdeck and the shuttle control room when Daniels left with the marker was Cross this whole time. Yet when Isaac heads for the shuttle to leave the Ishimura, Nicole, aka Cross, does not follow him. She's not present with him. You never see her leave the control room, yet she is there once you're prepped to leave. This made sense in the original because she was a hallucination, but here, this actually is Cross whom you are seeing as Nicole. That also means Isaac never once thought about contacting Cross to rescue her and was gonna leave her behind the whole time. They could have easily fixed this by having Cross leave with Isaac and help him fight off the necromorphs so that it sells the idea that maybe Nicole actually is alive in the remake, and that maybe Isaac isn't hallucinating. That way, when it's revealed Nicole was actually Cross, it has more impact. That would make this twist feel more authentic, earned, and fresh. Daniels ends up killing Cross and takes the loader remote from her that sends the marker back to the shuttle. And remember how long it took to bring the marker to the pedestal because of how slow the loading tracks were. Yet within a minute, Daniels and the marker are back at the landing pad and she's prepping for lunch. Don't know why the hive mind decides to kill Kendra, because her escaping with the marker would mean more people would get corrupted by its influence once it's returned to EarthGov, and help serve its purpose of making more necromorphs. Didn't make sense in the original, and it doesn't make sense now. The hive mind boss fight was on its way to becoming an improvement of the OG Dead Space, since it uses new tactics of spewing clusters and acid streams to trap you when it strikes with its primary tentacle whip. But then it had to be a final boss who spawns other minions to assist it like a bitch. What once worked before does not work well a second time. Not only is the ending jump scare expected if you already played the OG, but it's slower as well, so it loses its effectiveness. It's even worse when you realize there's a much better alternate ending that plays well into the context of Dead Space 2 that you can only get by completing the game a second time on New Game Plus while also collecting 12 different marker fragments scattered throughout the Ishimura. Hardcore players were already going to replay the game for speedrun purposes. You didn't need to hide an alternate ending for regular gamers to replay your remake.